The wanted poster nailed to the door of the territorial courthouse in Laramie, Wyoming, bore the face of Warren Reed sketched in charcoal with sharp cheekbones and eyes the color of a winter sky, and the words beneath that face made even hardened lawmen go quiet when they read them. Wanted dead or alive, $2,000 reward, most dangerous man west of the North Platte River. Eva Hart read that poster every single morning when she arrived at work, and every single morning she told herself that the case on her desk was just another case. She was lying to herself, and on some level she knew it. It was the spring of 1882, and the Wyoming Territory was a place still finding itself, a raw and violent stretch of earth where cattle barons ruled with iron fists, where the railroad had carved open the land like a wound, and where the law was a fragile thing that depended entirely on the courage of the people who carried it. Eva Hart was one of those people. At 31 years old, she was the circuit judge for the 3rd Judicial District of the Wyoming Territory, appointed 2 years prior by a governor who had been equal parts desperate and progressive. She rode a circuit that stretched 400 miles in every direction, presiding over cases in towns that sometimes had no proper building to hold court in, towns where she had delivered verdicts from the back of a wagon or in the back room of a saloon, while men with suspicious eyes watched her from beneath the brims of their hats. She was not a woman who frightened easily. She had grown up the daughter of a judge herself, in Cincinnati, Ohio, and had spent her girlhood reading law books the way other girls read fairy tales. She had studied under her father's guidance, had passed the territorial bar examination at the age of 26, and had spent 3 years as a prosecutor before the governor had seen something in her that made him think she was exactly the kind of stubborn, uncompromising person the territory needed on the bench. He had been right. Eva Hart did not bend. She did not barter. She did not look the other way when cattle barons expected leniency, and she did not go easy on men who assumed that because she was a woman, her courtroom was somehow a lesser place than a man's would have been. She stood 5 feet and 5 inches tall, with dark auburn hair that she kept pinned severely back when she was working, and brown eyes that people described as warm right up until the moment they became the focus of them in a professional capacity, at which point those same people tended to describe them as terrifying. She wore black almost exclusively, practical wool skirts and fitted jackets that she had tailored in Cheyenne, and she carried a small Remington pocket revolver in the inside pocket of that jacket not because she wanted to use it, but because the territory required that you be prepared to. The file on Warren Reed was 3 inches thick. She had been building it for 6 months, gathering depositions from witnesses who were often too frightened to give their names openly, collecting incident reports from marshals' offices across 3 counties, corresponding with the Pinkerton Detective Agency, which had been pursuing Reed for the better part of 4 years without success. The file documented 11 counts of robbery stagecoaches, railroad payrolls, the vault of the First National Bank of Rawlins, 2 counts of horse theft, 1 count of assault upon a federal deputy, and a string of smaller offenses that added up to a portrait of a man who seemed to operate entirely outside the reach of consequence. What the file did not adequately explain was why so many of the people that Warren Reed had robbed either refused to testify against him or, in several cases, actively spoke in his defense. That was the part that kept Eva awake at night, not because it complicated her case, though it did, but because it suggested that the picture she had assembled of Warren Reed might be missing something important. She was thinking about that discrepancy on the morning that Deputy Marshal Clem Bauer came through her courthouse door with his hat in his hands and the expression of a man who had either very good news or very bad news, and experience had taught Eva that with Clem Bauer it was almost always the latter. "We got him," Clem said. Eva set down her pen. She looked at Clem with the careful, steady attention that she gave to everything. "Where?" "Sweetwater County." One of the ranchers recognized him and sent word to the marshal's office. He was alone, from what they're saying. Gave himself up without a fight, which is the strangest part of the whole business, because you know as well as I do that Warren Reed has never in his life given himself up without a fight. Eva was already reaching for her coat. When can I expect him here? Marshal Dunning is bringing him up on the morning train the day after tomorrow. He'll be in the territorial jail by evening. Eva nodded. She looked at the file on her desk. She thought about the discrepancy. Clem, she said, I want you to do something for me. I want you to find out why he turned himself in. Clem turned his hat in his hands. Judge Hart, some men just get tired of running. Some men do, she agreed. But Warren Reed is not some men. Find out. The morning that Marshal Dunning arrived with his prisoner was a Thursday in late April, and the town of Laramie had turned out for it, the way towns turned out for events that broke the monotony of ordinary life. People lined the main street from the train depot to the jailhouse, some curious, some hostile, some children who had climbed onto fence posts to get a better view and been pulled down by their mothers. Eva watched from the window of her office, which gave her a clear line of sight to the street below. She was not prepared for what she saw. She had studied the charcoal sketch on the wanted poster so many times that she had formed an image in her mind of what Warren Reed looked like, and the man who stepped off that train was simultaneously exactly what she had expected and completely different from it. The sketch had captured the sharp bones of his face, the lean, angular jaw, the directness of his gaze. What it had not captured was the quality of stillness he carried with him, the way he moved through the crowd of gawkers and hostile faces with a kind of unhurried calm that suggested he was not particularly troubled by any of it. He was tall, a few inches over 6 feet, with dark hair that needed cutting and broad shoulders under a worn canvas coat. His hands were cuffed in front of him, and Marshal Dunning had him by one arm, but he walked with the bearing of a man who had chosen to be where he was. That was the thing that struck her most. He did not look like a captive. He looked like a man who had made a decision. He was 34 years old, according to the file. The file also said he had been born in Missouri, had fought on the Confederate side in the war between the states at the age of 17, had drifted west afterward like so many young men, who had come home from the war to find that home no longer existed in any meaningful way, and had crossed the line from ordinary drifting into outright lawbreaking sometime around 1875, in circumstances that the file described as unclear. Eva watched until Marshal Dunning had steered his prisoner through the door of the jailhouse, and then she went back to her desk and sat down and read the file again from the beginning. She found Clem waiting for her the next morning with the information she had asked for. He sat across from her desk with the same uncomfortable expression he'd worn 2 days prior, which told her she was right that it was not a simple answer. He turned himself in because of a woman named Clara Potts, Clem said. She's a widow in Sweetwater County, got 4 children, youngest is only 3 years old. Her husband died last winter of a fever, left her with a ranch that's got a mortgage on it. The bank is calling it in. She's got 30 days to come up with $400 or she loses the place. Eva waited. Reed has been through that county before. Apparently he knows the Potts family or knew the husband. The story I'm getting from the people out there is that Reed told the marshal he'd come in peacefully on the condition that the reward money, the $2,000, goes directly to Clara Potts. The room was very quiet for a moment. Did Marshal Dunning agree to that? Eva asked. He said he'd pass it along to the relevant parties, Clem said carefully, which I guess means you. Eva sat with this for a long moment. She thought about the discrepancy in the file. She thought about the witnesses who had refused to testify, who had in some cases actively defended a man the law had labeled the most dangerous outlaw west of the river. She thought about what it meant that this man who had robbed banks and stagecoaches and payrolls, had surrendered himself voluntarily, had walked into captivity for the sake of a widow's 4 children and a $400 mortgage. Set up a meeting, she said. I want to speak with the prisoner. Clem blinked. "That's a little unusual, Judge." "A great many things about this case are unusual," she said. "Set up the meeting." The jailhouse in Laramie was a solid stone building with 2 cells, and a front office that smelled of tobacco and coffee and old paper. Marshal Dunning was a compact, capable man in his 50s who had been doing this work for 20 years, and who had the demeanor of someone who had seen enough that very little surprised him anymore. He showed Eva to the cell with a courtesy that was entirely professional, and then retreated to the front office and left her to it. Warren Reed was sitting on the narrow cot when she came in, his back against the stone wall, his arms resting on his knees. He looked up when she entered, and whatever he had been expecting, it was not her, because, for just a fraction of a moment, barely long enough to register, something shifted in the steadiness of his expression. Then it settled again, and he regarded her with that particular quality of calm she had noticed from her window. "Judge Hart," he said. His voice was low and even, with the slight roughness of a man who spent more time outdoors than in, and the vowels carried the ghost of a Missouri upbringing. "I was wondering if I'd get to meet you before the trial." "I don't ordinarily make a practice of speaking to defendants before trial," she said. She pulled the wooden chair from the corner of the cell and sat down in it, which clearly surprised him further. Most people who came to see Warren Reed in a jail cell stayed near the door. "But you are not an ordinary case, Mr. Reed." "Most people just call me Reed," he said, "or they call me worse things, either way." "I'll call you Mr. Reed," she said, "because I call everyone by their proper name, and I intend to extend you the same courtesy. Now, I'm told you requested that the reward money for your capture be given to a Mrs. Clara Potts of Sweetwater County. I want to hear about that from you directly." He studied her for a moment. His eyes, this close, were precisely the color the charcoal sketch had failed to capture, a pale, serious blue-gray, like the sky over the plains before a storm breaks. "Clara's husband, James Potts, was a decent man," he said. "I've known the family for going on 6 years. I've been through that country enough times that we had something resembling a friendship, though I know that sounds strange given everything else." He paused. "James died in February. Fever took him fast. Clara's got 4 children and $400 between her, and losing the only home those kids have ever known. I don't have $400 to give her, but somebody's going to pay $2,000 for my head eventually, and I figured I might as well have some say in who it goes to." Eva looked at him steadily. "You traded your freedom for a widow's mortgage." "I traded my freedom for the chance that somebody competent would handle the money properly," he said. "And I did some asking around before I walked into that marshal's office. You handle things properly, Judge Hart." She was quiet for a moment. "Flattery from a defendant is not something I put a great deal of stock in, Mr. Reed." "It's not flattery," he said, without any change in tone. "It's information. You sentenced Marcus Hale to 15 years and watched his lawyers try to have it overturned for 18 months and didn't move an inch. You threw out a fraudulent land claim that would have benefited the Consolidated Cattle Company, even though half the territory's business interests wanted you to uphold it. You're not somebody who can be purchased or pressured. That makes you rare out here." Eva looked at him for a long moment. The file had listed his crimes. The file had not listed, could not have listed this, the particular quality of his attention when he spoke to you, the way he chose his words with the care of a man who knew their weight. The file had not prepared her for the fact that Warren Reed was, in some essential and inconvenient way, precisely the kind of person she had the most difficulty dismissing. "The reward money is a separate matter from your trial," she said. "It will require a conversation with the governor's office and with the territorial marshal. I can make a recommendation, but I cannot make a promise." "I understand that. What I can tell you," she said, "is that I will look into Mrs. Potts's situation independently, and if there is something that can be done for her through proper legal channels, I will see that it is done, regardless of what happens in my courtroom." Something moved through his expression then, not quite surprise, something quieter than that, something that looked from a certain angle like the kind of gratitude that runs too deep to be easily displayed. "Thank you," he said simply. She stood, replaced the chair, and was nearly to the door when he spoke again. "Judge Hart," she paused, her hand on the iron door frame. "May I ask you something?" "You may ask." "Do you believe that a person can do wrong things for right reasons and have those two facts exist at the same time? Or does the law not allow for that kind of complexity?" She turned and looked at him over her shoulder. "The law," she said carefully, "is a framework, Mr. Reed. It is not a substitute for judgment. And no one who has ever spent time honestly with the law believes it captures the full complexity of human behavior." She held his gaze for a moment. "But the law is what I have to work with, and I intend to work with it honestly." She left him there in his cell, and she walked back to her office in the April wind, and she sat down at her desk with the file in front of her and the memory of those pale gray eyes in her mind, and she told herself, quite firmly, that this was a professional matter and she would treat it as such. She was lying to herself again, and this time she knew it rather more clearly. The weeks before the trial were busy ones, and Eva threw herself into the work with the intensity that had always been her best defense against unwanted thoughts. She wrote letters to the governor's office on the matter of the reward money. She interviewed witnesses in person, a process that was complicated by the fact that most of those witnesses lived at significant distances from Laramie and had to be brought in or visited. She rode out to 3 different counties with Clem and a court recorder named Augustus Webb, a nervous young man from Pennsylvania who had come west for the adventure, and discovered that adventure was primarily composed of discomfort and paperwork. She also, on 4 separate occasions over those 3 weeks, returned to the jailhouse to speak with Warren Reed, and she told herself each time that these conversations were strictly professional, strictly related to her preparation for trial, and each time she became slightly less convincing to herself on this point, because the conversations were not entirely professional. They began that way, questions about specific incidents, requests for his account of events that she compared against the accounts in her file. But they had a tendency to wander in ways that Eva, who was not in the habit of allowing conversations to wander, found herself not particularly inclined to prevent. He had opinions about the territorial cattle monopolies that were sharper and more historically grounded than most. He had read considerably, which surprised her, until he explained that when you spent long stretches of time in the kind of isolated places that an outlaw necessarily frequented, books were both portable and available at no cost if you left them where you found them. He had read history and philosophy and a great deal of literature, and he spoke about all of it with the directness of someone who had formed his own conclusions without the influence of formal schooling. He was funny, occasionally, in a dry and understated way that crept up on her. And he listened to her, actually listened, in the particular way that she had long since stopped expecting from most people, with the quality of attention that felt like a form of respect. On her 4th visit, she asked him about the war. It was late afternoon, and the light through the single barred window of the cell was long and golden, and he was quiet for a moment before he answered. "I was 17, he said. "My father took me with him because there was nobody left to leave me with. My mother had died the year before. He died at Chickamauga. I was there when it happened, and I buried him in a field that I could not have found again on a map if my life had depended on it." He paused. "I came home to a farm that had been burned. I was 19 years old and I had nothing and nobody, and I walked west because walking west was what a person did when everything behind them was gone." "And the first time you robbed something?" she asked quietly. He met her eyes. "It was a payroll wagon that belonged to a man named Silas Carver, who had taken 160 acres of land from a Shoshone family by forging a deed, who had driven 3 small ranching families off their property by cutting their water rights, and who was paying his workers 11 cents an hour in conditions that were not significantly better than what I had witnessed during the war." He paused again. I distributed what I took from that wagon among the families he had displaced. I have not since that first time kept a significant portion of what I have taken for myself. Eva looked at him. This was the piece the file had circled around without quite grasping. You've been doing this for 7 years, she said. You could have stopped. Yes, he said, I could have stopped. Why didn't you? He looked at her for a long moment. Because stopping would have required believing that the people I was helping had some other recourse, and they didn't. The law, Judge Hart, your law, the law you serve out here in these territories, it protects property and it protects capital, and it is only occasionally and imperfectly concerned with protecting the people who have neither. He said it without bitterness, as a plain statement of fact. I know that's not a comfortable thing for you to hear. No, she said honestly. It isn't. But you are not wrong that the law has been imperfectly applied in these territories. And you are not wrong that the people most harmed by that are the people with the least power. She leaned forward slightly. But you are also not the solution, Mr. Reed. One man outside the law making unilateral decisions about who deserves what, that is not a system. That is chaos with good intentions. Maybe so, he said. But chaos with good intentions has fed more children in Sweetwater County than your system has. She could not immediately argue with that. It frustrated her intensely that she could not. She went home that evening to the modest house she rented on the edge of Laramie's respectable residential district, and she sat at her kitchen table with a glass of water and the cold remains of a dinner she had forgotten to eat while it was warm. And she had the most direct and honest conversation with herself that she had managed in years. She acknowledged that she had been looking forward to her visits to the jailhouse. She acknowledged that the anticipation had been building throughout each day that she knew she was going. She acknowledged that the quality of her attention during those conversations had nothing clinical about it, and that Warren Reed's eyes in the afternoon light were something she had been carrying around in her mind in the hours between visits. She acknowledged all of this, and then she went to bed, and she lay awake for 2 hours thinking about the impossible shape of her situation. She was the judge on his case. She had to try him fairly. She had to deliver a verdict that was grounded entirely in the law and the evidence, uncorrupted by anything personal. That was not a flexible requirement. That was the entire foundation upon which her existence in this role depended. It was the thing that made her different from the corrupt officials and bought lawmen that populated these territories like weeds. And here she was, lying awake at midnight, thinking about a man she was going to have to send to prison. She made herself a promise in the dark. She would do her job with exactness and integrity. She would try the case fairly. And when it was over, when it was absolutely, completely, definitively over, she would sort out whatever this was. The trial of Warren Reed opened on a Tuesday morning in May in the Territorial Courthouse in Laramie, and there were so many people attempting to attend that Clem had to turn 36 of them away from the door. The courtroom held 60 people in its wooden gallery, and it was filled to capacity with a crowd that represented every kind of opinion on the matter: cattlemen who wanted Reed hanged, settlers who looked at him with something approaching reverence, newspaper men from as far as Denver and Chicago who had been writing about the case for months, and a collection of ordinary citizens drawn by the particular magnetism of any spectacle that seemed to contain a story larger than its individual facts. Eva entered the courtroom from the door behind the bench, took her place, and arranged her robes and her papers with the deliberate composure that she had learned to wear like armor. She did not allow herself to look at the defendant's table until she was entirely settled. When she did look, Warren Reed was sitting very straight in his chair beside his court-appointed attorney, a pale young man from Cheyenne named Holloway who had approximately 18 months of legal experience and the look of someone who had drawn a very short straw. Reed was wearing a clean shirt, dark canvas trousers, and boots that someone had polished. He was watching her with an expression that was entirely composed, and when their eyes met, He held her gaze for precisely the professional fraction of a second that the situation required before looking away. She felt it nonetheless. Right down through her sternum. She opened the trial. The prosecution was handled by a territorial attorney named Martin Cross, a capable and well-prepared man in his 40s who had tried to build a case that was focused and clear. He presented the evidence for 4 of the most well-documented robberies, called 7 witnesses, and argued that Warren Reed had operated with deliberate disregard for the law over a period of 7 years, and that the evidence supported conviction on all 11 counts. Young Holloway did his best. He was better than Eva had initially given him credit for. He found inconsistencies in several of the witness accounts, successfully challenged the chain of evidence for 3 of the counts, and made an argument about the absence of direct identification in 2 of the robbery cases that was legally sound enough to be taken seriously. He was plainly terrified, but he was also plainly committed, and Eva gave him credit for it. Reed himself testified for 2 hours on the 3rd day of the trial. He was the calmest man in the room. He did not deny the robberies. He acknowledged them directly, in plain terms, without theatrical remorse and without belligerence. He explained his reasoning in the same way he had explained it to Eva in the cell: the context of each action, the conditions of the people involved, the way the money had been used. He did not pretend to be innocent by the standard of the law. What he argued, quietly and without apology, was that innocence and guilt were not always the whole story. The courtroom was so quiet during his testimony that Eva could hear the creak of the gallery benches when people shifted. Martin Cross cross-examined him with the thorough efficiency of a man who understood that this witness was formidable and needed to be handled carefully. Reed answered every question directly and without evasion. At one point, Cross asked him whether he understood that what he had done was illegal, and Reed said, "Yes," and then waited, and Cross asked whether he felt any remorse, and Reed said, "I feel remorse for the fear I caused people in the course of those actions. I do not feel remorse for the outcomes, because the outcomes were that families kept their land and children were fed and widows were not turned out into the road. If that makes me a criminal, then I am a criminal, and I will accept whatever consequence this court applies." There was a sound in the gallery that was not quite a sound, more a collective release of breath. Eva did not allow her expression to change. But she felt the sound in her chest like the note of a bell. She delivered her verdict on the 5th day. The jury had deliberated for 6 hours and had returned with a conviction on 7 of the 11 counts. The 4 counts they had dismissed included 2 where Holloway's challenges to identification had been sufficient to create genuine reasonable doubt, and 2 where the chain of evidence had been too weak to support conviction. It was, by the standards of the case, a measured and honest verdict, and Eva respected the jury for it. What came next was her part. The sentencing guidelines for the convicted offenses, applied at their maximum, would have resulted in a sentence of 45 years. Applied at their minimum, they would have resulted in 12. Eva had spent the night before sentencing reading the guidelines and the case history and her own notes from the trial, and she had reached a decision that she was certain of, not because it was the politically safe decision. It was not particularly, but because it was the one that the law, honestly and completely applied, actually supported. She sentenced Warren Reed to 7 years in the Wyoming Territorial Prison, with the possibility of early release at 5 years pending good conduct. The courtroom erupted. The cattle interests were outraged. Several of the newspaper men wrote the following day that she had been too lenient. Several others wrote that her application of the mitigating circumstances was exactly the kind of nuanced jurisprudence the territories needed. The governor's office sent a letter that was carefully neutral. Clem Bauer told her privately that he thought she had gotten it right. She had the reward money transferred to Clara Potts before the end of the week. She sent a letter along with it, written in her own hand, explaining that the matter had been handled in accordance with the expressed wishes of the prisoner, and that she hoped Mrs. Potts and her family would be well. She did not visit Warren Reed in the jailhouse after the sentencing. She could not. He was to be transferred to the territorial prison in 2 weeks, and the case was closed, and she had nothing professionally legitimate that would take her through that door. She told herself this quite firmly for 13 days. On the 14th day, the day before the transfer, she went anyway. It was evening, and the jailhouse was quiet, and Marshal Dunning looked at her with an expression that was not quite surprise, but was certainly something he was working hard not to make visible. He let her through without comment. He was a man of considerable discretion, which was one of the reasons Eva had always respected him. Reed looked up from the cot with the same quality of attention he always had, except that this time something in it was different. He had known she would not come, and then she had come, and the discrepancy seemed to have reached him somewhere below the composed exterior. "You sentenced me fairly," he said. "I want you to know I understood that." 7 years is a long time, she said. She had not planned what she was going to say, which was unusual for her, and she was operating on something other than her usual careful structure. "It is," he agreed. "But I have been outside the law for 7 years, and I have been a burden on people who tried to protect me and a danger to people who didn't deserve to be frightened. 7 years inside the law might do me some good." A pause, assuming the world doesn't end while I'm in there. "It won't," she said. "I'll make sure of it." He looked at her for a long moment. "That's a significant promise, Judge Hart." "My name is Eva," she said. It came out quietly, without the armor, without the careful professional distance. "You have been through my courtroom, Mr. Reed. I think we have arrived at first names." The expression on his face, the way it opened slightly like a door that has been very carefully kept closed for a very long time, was the most private thing she had ever witnessed, and she felt the privilege of it like a weight in her chest. "Warren," he said. "Warren." She said it carefully, like she was learning the shape of it. "I want to tell you something, and I want you to understand that I am not in the habit of saying things I do not mean." She sat down in the chair. "I will look after Clara Potts's situation, not as a favor to you, but because it is the right thing to do. I will write to the prison. I will keep track of your conduct record. And when you are released, whether that is 5 years or 7, I would like to know how you are." He was very still. "Why?" She looked at him honestly. "Because you are the most interesting and the most confounding person I have encountered in my professional life, and I believe that within the framework of a completely different set of circumstances you might be the kind of man worth knowing in a different way." The silence lasted a long moment. Outside, a horse went past on the street. The lamp in the corner of the cell threw warm shadows across the stone walls. "Eva," he said, and her name in his voice had a quality she had not heard in it before, careful, almost wondering. "I will be a better man in 5 years than I am today. I can promise you that, because there are very few other things I have left to promise anyone, and I would like to use what I have on something that matters." She stood. She put her hand through the iron bars of the cell door, an impulsive gesture that she did not regret, and he took it in both of his cuffed hands with a care so precise it felt like the most formal and serious thing she had ever been part of. "Write to me," she said. "If they allow you to, write." "I will," he said. She went home. She sat at her kitchen table for a long time in the dark. Then she lit the lamp and got out a piece of paper and began to make a list of the practical steps she was going to take on behalf of Clara Potts, because doing something useful with her hands was how Eva Hart had always managed the things her heart did not have a protocol for. The years that followed were not simple, and they were not empty, and they were not entirely painful, though there were moments that were each of those things in varying proportions. Eva continued her circuit. She tried cases across 4 counties, made enemies among the cattle interests with such regularity that it almost became routine, and made a quiet reputation for herself as the kind of judge whose courtroom was a place where the law actually meant something. She dealt with the loneliness of her particular life, a woman in a role that isolated her socially in ways that were difficult to explain to people who had not experienced it, with the same practical determination she applied to everything else. She had 2 good friends, a physician named Dr. Myra Calloway, who ran the only medical practice in Laramie, and who was one of the very few people whose company Eva genuinely sought, and old Augustus Webb, the court recorder, who had survived his introduction to adventure in the West and become something between a colleague and a beloved younger brother. She received the first letter from Warren Reed 4 months after his transfer. It came via the prison administration office and had been read by the warden before delivery, as was standard practice, which meant the letter was carefully worded and said less than it might have otherwise. But it said enough. He had settled into the routine of prison with the same methodical calm he appeared to apply to everything. He was working in the prison's small library, organizing and cataloging books. He was teaching reading to 3 other prisoners who could not read. He asked about her work in a way that was specific and interested. He asked about Clara Potts. She wrote back. She was also careful because she knew the letter would be read, but she was honest, which was something she could not stop herself from being. A correspondence developed. It was slow and deliberate and shaped by the constraints of the medium and the eyes it passed through, but over the months and then the years it built into something that was more precise and more revealing than most conversations she had with people she saw every day. Letters required you to say what you meant. Letters required you to think before you spoke. Letters revealed, over time, the architecture of a person's mind in a way that casual acquaintance never could. She learned that he had a dry and quietly wicked sense of humor that had survived the circumstances largely intact. She learned that he had taught himself to write with considerable care, that his sentences were constructed with the attention of someone for whom language had been both scarce and precious. She learned that he was genuinely interested in the world and in ideas, and that he thought about justice, not legal justice specifically, but the larger concept of it, with a seriousness and an openness that she found she could engage with honestly in ways she could not with most people. She wrote about her cases, carefully, in terms that preserved confidentiality, but allowed her to describe the intellectual challenges. She wrote about the territory, about the changes she was watching it go through as more settlers arrived, and the cattle barons fought to hold their dominance, and the railroad continued its slow, inevitable transformation of everything. She wrote about the things she believed, which was not something she had done in writing with anyone before, and the experience of doing so was something she had no adequate word for except necessary. She visited Clara Potts herself, making a detour in her circuit that was not strictly required by geography. Clara Potts was a small, competent woman in her late 30s with 4 children who bore the particular gravity of children who had understood that the world could take things from you. She received Eva with careful dignity and genuine warmth, and she made it clear that she was aware of Eva's role in the matter of the reward money, and that she considered it a debt she was not sure how to repay. "You don't owe me anything," Eva said. "The person who made this possible is Warren Reed. I was simply the mechanism." "I know that," Clara said quietly. "Warren is a complicated man, but he has always done right by people who had no one else to do right by them." She paused. "Is he well?" "As well as a man can be in his circumstances," Eva said. "He is keeping himself busy with productive things, which I believe suits him." Clara looked at her for a moment with the perceptiveness of a woman who had learned to read the spaces between words. She said nothing more on the subject, but her expression suggested she had understood something that Eva had not yet allowed herself to articulate clearly. The 4th year of Warren's sentence was the year the territorial legislature attempted to pass the Water Rights Consolidation Act, which would have effectively transferred control of most of the territory's water resources to a consortium of large cattle operations, and permanently destroyed the economic viability of small ranching and farming throughout the region. Eva, as a circuit judge, was not technically a political actor, but the act had direct legal implications for her jurisdiction, and she had both the right and, she believed, the obligation to submit formal commentary to the legislative committee reviewing it. Her commentary was 40 pages long and was widely reprinted and discussed. It was also the thing that, more than anything else she had done in her career to that point, made her genuinely powerful enemies. The Consolidated Cattle Company, which stood to benefit most from the act, had lawyers and money and politicians in its pocket, and it began a sustained campaign to have her removed from the bench on grounds of overreach. The process took 8 months. She was subjected to a formal review by the Territorial Judicial Council, which required her to defend her actions in considerable detail. And during those 8 months, she discovered who her genuine supporters were, and who had merely been tolerating her. The review ultimately concluded in her favor. Her commentary had been within the bounds of judicial commentary on legislative matters, which was an established legal tradition, but the campaign had made her position more precarious, and she knew it. She wrote to Warren about it in careful terms. His letter back was the longest he had written, and also the least guarded, perhaps because he understood that this was the kind of thing you did not have adequate language for if you were being careful. He wrote that she was the most courageous person he knew, which, coming from a man who had spent 7 years evading Pinkerton agents and territorial marshals, said something. He wrote that he was counting the months. He wrote that there were things he had been wanting to say in letters that he had not said because letters were imperfect, and he preferred the idea of saying them in person. She read that part twice. Then she folded the letter carefully and put it with the others, which she kept in a cedar box in the top drawer of her desk. She was also, during this period, deeply involved in the continuing legal situation of the territory's indigenous communities, specifically the Shoshone people in the western parts of her circuit, who were facing increasing pressure from settlers and land speculators, who used a variety of legal and extra-legal means to encroach on treaty-protected lands. The law was imperfect on this subject. As Warren had noted, the law was frequently imperfect in ways that protected the powerful and harmed the vulnerable, and this was an area where the imperfection was egregious. Eva worked within the constraints available to her, which were not sufficient but were not nothing, and she made decisions in the cases she could touch that were the most honest interpretations of the treaty law she was capable of reaching. She was under no illusions that this solved anything, but she believed that what the law could protect, it should protect, and that the slow accumulation of honest decisions was better than the alternative of dishonest ones, even when honesty fell short of justice. She wrote to Warren about this too. He understood the landscape she was describing, literally and figuratively, in ways that made the correspondence feel like thinking aloud with someone who had covered the same territory. 5 years passed. They passed the way years pass when you are working hard and paying attention, quickly in retrospect and slowly in the living of them. The letter from the prison warden arrived in the 3rd week of April, 1887, and told her that Warren Reed had been recommended for early release on the basis of exemplary conduct, successful completion of an educational program, and a formal assessment by the prison chaplain, and the warden that he posed no ongoing danger to the community. Release was set for the 1st of May. Eva read the letter at her office desk and then sat completely still for approximately 5 minutes. Then she walked to the window and looked out at the main street of Laramie, which was going about its ordinary business in the ordinary April morning, and she understood with sudden clarity that she had been managing the distance and the letters and the careful, disciplined hope for 5 years, and that the distance was about to disappear, and that she had no protocol for what came next. She wrote him a letter that she spent 4 drafts on before she arrived at something she could send. She told him she was glad. She told him that if he had need of a recommendation for employment or a character attestation of any kind, she would provide one without hesitation. She told him that if he was willing, she would like to meet him for supper at the Grand Hotel in Laramie on the 3rd evening of May, which would give him time to make the journey and collect himself. His reply arrived 9 days later, the last letter he wrote from inside the prison, and it said simply, "I will be there." The evening of May 3rd was warm and clear. The kind of spring evening that the Wyoming Territory produced when it was feeling generous, with a sky that had gone purple and gold in the west, and the air carrying the particular smell of new grass and turned earth that Eva had come to associate with the territory's brief and extravagant springs. She had gone back to her house after her day's work and had dressed with unusual care a deep blue-gray dress, a better cut than her working clothes, her hair done in a less severe arrangement than the pins she wore on the bench, and had then stood in front of her small mirror for a moment and told herself that she was being ridiculous, that this was a practical meeting between two people who had exchanged letters for 5 years and needed to re-establish the terms of whatever came next, and that there was no reason whatsoever to be nervous. She was nervous. The Grand Hotel dining room was the best establishment in Laramie, which was not saying as much as it would have in a larger city, but it was clean and well lit, and served actual food rather than the approximation of food available at most establishments in the territory. She arrived a few minutes before the agreed time and was shown to a table near the window. She was looking out at the street when she heard the door open and felt, before she looked, the particular quality of awareness that had been there since the first time she had looked up from the charcoal sketch and seen the real thing walking down the main street in Marshall Dunning's grip. Warren Reed had changed in 5 years. He was older, which was obvious and expected. The dark hair had more gray in the temples than it had before. He was leaner than he had been in the jail cell, with the kind of rangy, careful fitness of a man who had kept himself moving in a small space. He wore clean clothes, a dark jacket, a white shirt, boots that were worn but whole, and he carried his hat in his hands, which made him look, for just a moment, like someone young enough to still be uncertain about something. He saw her. He crossed the room to the table. He stopped when he reached it and looked at her in that way. He had the complete, undisguised quality of his attention, and for a long moment neither of them said anything. "Eva," he said. "Hello, Warren." He sat down. He put his hat on the empty chair beside him. The waiter came and they ordered, and then the waiter went away and they were alone at a table in a restaurant in the ordinary world, without bars or institutional correspondence or the formal structures of the law between them, and it felt simultaneously like the most natural thing that had ever happened and like standing on the edge of something very high. "You look exactly the same," he said, "and completely different." "So do you," she said. 5 years is a long time, and also not nearly as long as it felt," he said. He looked at her steadily. "I've been thinking about what I wanted to say to you for a significant portion of that time, and I find that now that I'm here, all of the careful language I prepared has become somewhat unreliable." She felt something loosen in her chest. "Then say the unreliable version." He looked at her. "I am in love with you," he said. "I have been in some stage of becoming so since approximately the 3rd visit in the jail cell when you told me that the law was a framework and not a substitute for judgment. And I have been entirely certain of it since you wrote to me about the Water Rights Act, and I sat in a prison library in the middle of the night reading your letter by lamp, and understood that you were the most remarkable person I had encountered in my entire life, which has not been short on encounters." He paused. "I know that this comes with significant complications. I have a conviction record. I have no occupation and no property and nothing in my name except the clothes I am wearing and the $8 that the prison released to me this morning. I am not an obvious match for a territorial judge who has spent 5 years building something that matters. I know all of that." She had been listening to him with a stillness that looked composed and was not composed at all. "I am also in love with you," she said, which she had not entirely planned to lead with, but which was accurate, and which, she had learned from 5 years of letters, was always better than careful management. "And I have been thinking about the complications you mentioned, and I want to tell you something about that." He waited. "The law that convicted you is the same law I spend every day trying to make into something better than it has been," she said. "The record is a record. It does not define everything that comes after it, And as for the rest, the occupation, the property, those are practical problems, and practical problems are the kind I am best at solving." She paused. "What I cannot solve is the question of whether you are the kind of person who can live inside the law honestly. Not because someone requires it, but because you have genuinely arrived at that place yourself." "I have," he said quietly. "5 years gave me considerable time to arrive there. I'm not interested in living outside it. I'm interested in using what I know about what it fails to do to work within it for something better." He met her eyes. "I was thinking if you might be able to advise me about the bar examination." Eva stared at him. "The bar examination. I have been studying the law quite seriously for 4 years," he said. "The prison library had several legal texts. I have been corresponding, through the warden's office, with a law professor in Denver who has been kind enough to review my work. He believes I am within a year of being ready to sit the territorial examination." She could not speak for a moment. She was not, ordinarily, a woman who was rendered speechless, and the experience was not entirely unwelcome because it felt appropriate to the magnitude of what she was hearing. "You want to become a lawyer," she said. "I want to be useful within the structure of the thing, rather than in opposition to it," he said. "And I believe I have a reasonably thorough understanding of both sides of it, which might be useful in a courtroom." Eva looked at him across the table in the warm restaurant light, and she thought about the 5 years of letters, and the quality of his thought in those letters, and the way his mind worked, and the fact that Warren Reed, studying law for 4 years in a prison library and corresponding with a professor in Denver, was, when you understood the particular nature of the man, not remotely surprising, and was, in fact, exactly right. She started to laugh. It was a genuine laugh, the kind that comes from deep enough that it surprises you, and she pressed her hand briefly to her mouth and then gave up trying to contain it, and Warren Reed watched her laugh with the expression of a man in whom something very long under tension had finally, quietly released. "I will help you study," she said, when she had recovered. "And I know Judge Whitmore in Cheyenne, who sits on the bar examination committee. I will write to him about your background and your conduct record and the circumstances that preceded your conviction, and I believe he will be fair." She met his eyes. "Will you come to supper again on Saturday? We could begin with contract law, which is the area I find most candidates are weakest on. We could also begin with the fact that I have not seen your face for 5 years and would like very much to look at it for a while longer before we discuss contract law," he said, in the quiet, direct way that was entirely his. "That," she said, "is not something I have any objection to." They talked through supper and past it, long after the other diners had gone, and the waiter was making his third circuit of the room with an expression of supreme professional patience. They talked about ideas and about the territory and about the law and about small practical things. Where he was staying, a boarding house 2 streets from the courthouse, and what the food was like at the prison, unambiguous on this point, and what the library had looked like, better stocked than you would expect, largely due to the efforts of a former schoolteacher who had come to minister to the prisoners and left a collection of books that had changed the interior landscape of the institution, and what she had planted in the small garden behind her rented house, tomatoes, unsuccessfully, and herbs, more successfully. They talked until the waiter very gently informed them that the restaurant would be closing momentarily, and then they walked out into the clear night and stood on the street in the warm dark. He offered her his arm to walk her home. She took it. At the gate of her house, with the oil lamp on the porch casting a warm light and the stars enormous in the black sky above them, she turned to face him. "I should tell you," she said quietly, "that in my professional life I have never once allowed my personal circumstances to affect my conduct on the bench. That will not change." "I would not want it to," he said, with complete sincerity. "And in my personal life I have historically been somewhat better at the practical aspects than the tender ones," she added. "I am working on that." "I can wait," he said. "I am, as it turns out, extremely patient." She looked up at him in the lamplight. She thought about the charcoal sketch on the wanted poster, and the man who had walked down the main street, and the cell in the jailhouse, and the cedar box full of letters in the top drawer of her desk. And she leaned up and kissed him with the deliberateness of a woman who had made a careful decision and was committing to it fully. He kissed her back with the same quality of attention he brought to everything, complete, unhurried, as though this was the thing he had been meaning to do for a long time, and there was no reason now to do it imprecisely. When she went inside, she stood at her kitchen table in the dark for a moment, and then she smiled at nobody in particular, which was a thing she was not in the habit of doing, and then she went to bed and slept very soundly for the first time in longer than she could honestly account for. The spring of 1887 moved into summer, and summer into fall, and the world did not end, and the territory continued its complicated process of becoming something. Not yet fully a state, not yet fully civilized in the way the Eastern newspapers meant when they used that word, but alive and demanding and full of the particular beauty of difficult places. Warren studied. He studied with the same ferocious, methodical intensity that he had apparently applied to everything he had chosen to do throughout his life, and Eva helped him with that study on the evenings they spent together, which became most evenings, at either his boarding house table or her kitchen table over cold coffee and stacks of casebooks. He was a very good student in the precise sense that he asked questions when he did not understand something and argued when he thought she was wrong, and was frequently right enough to make the arguments worthwhile. He had an instinct for the law that she recognized as genuine, the ability to move between the abstract principle and the specific application without losing the thread of either, which was rarer than most law schools wanted to admit. He also, in those months, became a person in the town of Laramie in ways that mattered. He did odd work carpentry, at which he turned out to be skilled in a way he had never mentioned, helping to build a new wing on the school building, and repairing the frame of the church that the wind had damaged the previous winter. He was known because his face was known, and there were people who regarded him with suspicion, and people who regarded him with the kind of warmth that the story of Clara Potts had generated, and he handled both with the same quality of equanimity that was, Eva had come to understand, both a natural disposition and a hard-won discipline. He met Myra Calloway, who regarded him with the careful, diagnostic interest of a physician assessing something that did not fit neatly into her existing categories, and ultimately concluded that he was genuine, which was Myra's highest commendation. He and Augustus Webb became friends of a kind that amused Eva greatly, the former outlaw and the nervous court recorder discovering that they shared an extensive knowledge of obscure historical events and a mutual appreciation for a particular kind of dry, factual humor. Clara Potts came to Laramie in October with all 4 children on the back of her wagon to sell some produce and see the doctor about her youngest, who had a persistent cough. She and Warren saw each other on the main street, and Eva, who was watching from the window of the courthouse, saw the way they greeted each other. The way Warren crouched down to be at eye level with the children, the way Clara's expression was that of a woman who had carried something difficult for a long time, and was genuinely glad to see that the weight had not broken the person she had worried about. Clara looked up at one point and saw Eva at the window and gave her a nod that said more than words, and Eva nodded back. In the spring of 1888, Warren Reed sat the Wyoming Territorial Bar examination in Cheyenne. Eva rode the circuit to Carbon County that week and tried very hard not to think about it, which was entirely unsuccessful. She received his letter the following week, which said, with characteristic understatement, "I have passed. I believe I owe you approximately 800 hours of contract law instruction. I am working on how to repay this debt." She wrote back, "I have a suggestion. Marry me." She had not planned to propose by letter. She had planned, to the extent she had planned anything, to do it in person over supper at the Grand Hotel, with the proper deliberateness the occasion deserved. But the letter was already written, and it was accurate, and Eva Hart had never in her life sent something back that was accurate and necessary just because the timing was imperfect. His reply arrived 3 days later, by which point she was back from her circuit and home. She opened the letter at her kitchen table in the morning light and read, "This is not the worst idea you have ever had. In fact, it is the best idea anyone has ever had. Yes." Followed by, in slightly different ink as though written at a different moment, "I am coming to Laramie on Friday. Please arrange for someone other than yourself to be present when I ask you properly, because I would like there to be witnesses." He arrived on Friday as promised, and he asked her properly in the front parlor of Myra Calloway's house, with Myra and Augustus and Clem Bauer present as witnesses, all of whom had been recruited by a series of brief notes delivered that afternoon with the straightforward efficiency that was one of the things Eva most loved about the man. He went down on one knee on Myra's parlor rug, which was blue and somewhat worn, and he held her hand in both of his, and he said, "Eva Hart, you are the most honest and the most difficult and the most extraordinary person in my experience of the world, and I would like to spend the remainder of my considerable life continuing to be challenged and corrected and loved by you, if you will have me." She said yes, which she had already said by letter, but which deserved to be said again in person. Myra produced a bottle of good whiskey from somewhere, and Clem made a toast that was shorter than anyone expected and more moving, and Augustus cried quietly into his glass, which he denied later. The evening was one of those evenings that you carry with you afterward, because the quality of the light and the company and the particular happiness of it sets it apart from ordinary evenings in a way that does not diminish with time. They were married in June, a small wedding in the Laramie church, the one Warren had helped repair, which felt appropriate with Myra as Eva's witness and Augustus as Warren's, and Marshall Dunning in attendance because he had been there at the beginning, and it seemed right that he should be there for this part. The ceremony was performed by the circuit minister, a man named Reverend Parks, who had married and buried and christened half the territory, and who performed the ceremony with the unsentimental warmth of a man who had witnessed enough human experience to understand what these occasions meant. Warren had taken a position as a junior attorney with a small practice in Laramie, a firm with two partners who were known for taking cases that other firms avoided, primarily representing the small ranchers and settlers and workers who had limited resources and significant legal needs. It was, he told Eva, the most natural place he could imagine to be useful, and she agreed with him. She continued her circuit. She continued to be difficult for the cattle interests and a reliable presence for everyone else, and the cases on her docket reflected the continuing transformation of the territory disputes about land and water and wages and rights, the ongoing and imperfect negotiation of what this place was going to be. She was appointed to a second term by the same governor, who had by this point decided that having Eva Hart on the bench was worth whatever political difficulty it generated, because the alternative, a less principled judge in a territory that was growing rapidly and needed stability and fairness to grow into something viable, was considerably worse. Their house was the one she had been renting, which they purchased outright, Warren's carpentry work and Eva's salary combining over the course of the first year of marriage into enough to make the transaction possible. He expanded the kitchen because she had mentioned once that the kitchen was too small, though the mention had been brief, and she had not expected him to have retained it. He built shelves in the study for their combined library of casebooks and history texts and novels, which together occupied considerably more shelf space than the study had previously been prepared for. The first winter after their marriage, when the snow was deep and the circuit was suspended and they were both home, was the kind of time that Eva had not known she had been missing until she had it. The long evenings with the fire and a shared meal and conversation that continued naturally from the letters they had been writing for 5 years without losing anything in translation from written to spoken word. They argued about cases, which was both professionally inappropriate and personally exhilarating, and they read aloud to each other in the evenings, alternating choices between his tendency toward history and philosophy and her tendency toward legal theory and the occasional novel, and they discovered that their respective tastes were more compatible than you might have predicted. He was a good man in the domestic sense of the word as well as the larger one. He noticed things. He remembered things she said in passing. He made coffee in the mornings, which he had developed an opinion about regarding the correct strength, and his opinion was correct, which she would not tell him directly but which was reflected in the fact that she accepted the cup he brought her every morning without comment, which said everything. She loved him with a particular quality of love that was entirely her own, not a sentiment but a conviction, not a feeling that arrived and receded but a daily renewed decision, a choosing. She had spent 31 years being precise and thorough about everything in her life, and she brought that precision and thoroughness to this too, which he appreciated in the way that a man who has spent a long time being misread appreciates being accurately understood. In the spring of 1889, the Wyoming Territory passed the Wyoming Enabling Act, which set the process in motion for statehood, and as part of the broader changes that came with that process, the territorial legislature, in a move that surprised almost everyone, included women's suffrage in the new state constitution, making Wyoming the first state in the Union to guarantee women the right to vote. Eva had written extensively about the legal basis for this in her judicial commentaries over the preceding 3 years, and while she was not naive enough to claim direct credit for the outcome, she was honest enough to understand that the accumulated pressure of honest argument over time had been a contributing factor. She stood in the courthouse square the morning the news arrived from Cheyenne and felt a complicated and specific joy that was not the simple joy of victory, but the deeper joy of something she had worked toward with the tools she had available over many years, finally arriving in the world. Warren was beside her. He had come out of his office when the news spread down the street, and he stood with her in the morning sun and said nothing because there was nothing that needed to be said, and he understood that. After a while she said, "This is not enough. There is still so much that is not enough." "No," he agreed, "but it is more than there was yesterday. That is how it works." She looked at him. "You have become alarmingly wise for a man who spent 7 years robbing stagecoaches." "5," he said. "There were 4 years when I was primarily robbing payrolls." She laughed. He put his arm around her in the middle of the courthouse square in front of whoever happened to be watching, which was her, she had discovered, entirely comfortable with, in a way that had surprised her about herself. She was not a person who had ever been particularly inclined toward public displays of feeling. Apparently, Warren Reed was the exception to a number of rules she had believed about herself, which she had decided was one of his best qualities. Their son was born in October of 1889, as Wyoming was moving through the formal process of becoming a state, in the bedroom of their house in Laramie with Myra Calloway, presiding over the birth with the steady, no-nonsense competence she brought to everything medical. He was healthy and loud and had, from the first day, his father's particular quality of directed attention, a habit of looking at things with complete focus before responding that made him seem, as a newborn, considerably more deliberate than newborns generally had occasion to be. They named him James, for the late James Potts of Sweetwater County, which was a private gesture that meant what it meant. Clara Potts came to Laramie for the christening, with all 4 of her children, who were now old enough to conduct themselves in a church, without requiring the level of active management they had required 3 years earlier. She held James and looked at him with the expression of a woman who understood that she was holding something that was connected to a long thread of events, and she said something quiet to Eva that Eva did not repeat because it was between them. Warren's legal career developed in the years that followed in a way that was consistent with the particular shape of his abilities. He developed a specialty in land rights cases, representing small farmers and ranchers against encroachment by larger interests, working through treaty law and property law, and the complicated overlap between them, with the thoroughness of someone who had seen the system from every possible angle. He was not a polished courtroom lawyer in the dramatic sense. He was quiet and precise and very well prepared, and judges found him credible and juries found him honest, which proved to be more effective than drama in most of the cases that mattered. Eva tried several of his cases from the bench, which required both of them to maintain a rigorous professional composure that they managed without difficulty, because they were both people who understood what that requirement meant and why it mattered. The cases were handled with complete impartiality. Anyone watching would not have been able to identify any difference in the way Eva Hart treated the arguments of Warren Reed and the arguments of any other attorney in her courtroom, which was precisely as it should be. They did not discuss ongoing cases at home. This was a line they had agreed on from the beginning and maintained without exception. They discussed the law in the abstract, constantly and with considerable enthusiasm, which was different and which neither of them could have given up without losing something essential. James grew into a boy who was, from about the age of 3, persistently and exhaustingly curious about everything, which both parents found equal parts delightful and tiring. He followed Warren around during carpentry projects with the particular focus of a child who intends to understand how things work, and he demanded that Eva read him not just stories, but explanations of how and why things were as they were, which she provided with considerable thoroughness for a tired woman who had just finished a long week on the circuit. Their daughter was born in the winter of 1892, 3 years after James, and was named Rose, because Eva had been thinking about the word for a week before the birth and could not improve on it. Rose arrived with a different temperament from her brother. Where James was deliberate and precise, Rose was immediate and fierce, with opinions from approximately the age of 8 months that she was not shy about expressing. She had Eva's dark auburn hair and Warren's gray eyes, and the combination, people said, was something. The decade turned into the next one, and the territory they had made their life in continued to change around them, which was the nature of the West. Nothing stayed still. Everything pushed forward into something new, sometimes better and sometimes not, but always insistently becoming. Warren's practice grew. Eva's reputation grew with it. She was offered a federal appointment in 1894, which she considered seriously and then declined because the federal district was in Washington, and she was not prepared to leave Wyoming, which had become not just where she lived but what she had chosen in a deep and irreversible way. She wrote a legal commentary that year, published in the Territorial Law Review, that became widely cited in cases involving indigenous land rights across several territories. It was not, she knew, sufficient. The law on this subject was inadequate, and her commentary was an attempt to push it towards something better through the leverage points available to her, which were limited. She was honest about those limitations in the commentary itself, which several people told her was unusual and admirable, and she told those people she simply considered it accurate. Warren read the commentary the evening she received the first printed copies, sitting by the fire with James asleep upstairs, and Rose finally settled after an energetic and complicated evening. He read it all the way through without stopping, and when he finished, he looked up at her over the pages with the particular expression that was his version of moved, quiet, and deep, and not easily visible to people who had not learned to read him. "This is the best thing you have written," he said. "I know," she said, which was not vanity but accuracy, and which made him smile because he knew the difference. She looked at him in the firelight, older than the man who had walked down that main street with his hands in cuffs, with lines at the corners of his eyes and more gray in his hair, and the settled, inhabited quality of a man who had found the place where he was supposed to be. and felt the same thing she had felt that first evening in the Grand Hotel dining room, except deeper because it had had years to grow into. The winter of 1895 was long and difficult, as Wyoming winters had a habit of being, with snow that came in November and did not fully relent until late March and temperatures that required serious commitment to remain outdoors for any practical purpose. The circuit was suspended for the worst of it, and Eva was home for most of 3 months, which was the longest sustained period she had spent at home in years. She used the time to write a full legal treatise on water rights in the territories that she had been accumulating material for across the preceding decade. Warren was home more than usual too, the ranch and farm cases slowing in winter, and the house had the particular quality of a household that is fully inhabited. James at 11, helping his father with the carpentry project Warren had undertaken to build shelves in the children's bedroom. Rose at 3, making her particular form of determined chaos in every room she entered. Eva at the kitchen table with her papers and her coffee, making the kind of progress that required quiet and was impossible to achieve during the writing months. It was not always quiet. It was, in fact, frequently not quiet. But even the noise had a quality to it that Eva, who had spent most of her adult life in the particular silence of a person who lives alone, recognized as something she had not known she was missing. One evening in February, with the snow heavy against the windows and James in bed and Rose finally asleep after an unusually extended campaign of resistance, Warren came and sat at the kitchen table across from her with 2 cups of coffee and the expression of a man who has been thinking about something for a while. "I want to tell you something," he said. She looked up from her papers. She waited. "I have been thinking about the fact that I wasted a significant portion of my life doing things that were useful in the short term and harmful in the long term, and I am aware that the life I have now is something I did not earn through any straightforward process." He paused. "But I also think that the things I did in those years, the wrong things, gave me a particular kind of knowledge that I have been able to use in the right direction since. And I am not sure how to feel about that, whether it is a form of justification or a form of grace." She looked at him for a long moment. "I think," she said carefully, "that people are not their worst decisions and they are not their best ones either. They are the accumulation of everything, and what they do with that accumulation is what matters." She put her hand on the table between them and he covered it with his. "You have used what you have with honesty and care. I cannot think of a higher standard to hold it to." He looked at her steadily. "You are," he said, "the best thing I have ever managed to do right." She felt this somewhere fundamental. She squeezed his hand. "Likewise," she said, which was her version of the same thing and which he understood perfectly. Outside, the snow continued to fall, quiet and enormous, covering the town of Laramie and the courthouse and the jailhouse and the street, where she had first watched him walk in chains, in the hotel where they had first sat across a table from each other and talked until the waiter gave up waiting for them to leave. Covering the territory that was a state now, that was still becoming what it was going to be, that required stubborn and honest people to help it get there. Inside the house, the lamps were lit and the fire was warm, and 2 children slept upstairs, James with his father's stillness and Rose with her mother's determination already forming in her small face. There was coffee on the table and papers and the comfortable evidence of 2 lives thoroughly intertwined. His law books and her case books on the same shelves, his boots at the door beside her riding coat, the permanent middle ground that they had built between them of honesty and argument and deep, committed love. Eva Hart had spent 31 years being exactly what she was, precise and difficult and uncompromising, and had spent years believing, without quite acknowledging the belief, that those qualities made her unsuited for the kind of tenderness that other people seemed to find without effort. She had been wrong about that, as it turned out. The precision and the difficulty and the refusal to compromise were not obstacles to love. They were, in the right circumstances and with the right person, the exact conditions under which love could be built into something that held. She had tried the most feared outlaw west of the North Platte River and sentenced him to 7 years, and visited him the night before his transfer and written him letters for 5 years and proposed by mail, and married him in the church he had helped repair and built a life with him that was, by every measure she was capable of applying to the question, the right life. She picked up her pen. She went back to her treatise on water rights. Warren drank his coffee and watched her work with the quiet, appreciative attention that was his best and most private quality. The snow fell. The lamps burned. The night continued, warm and untroubled, in the house on the edge of Laramie where the law and the man who had spent years outside it had found, through the most unlikely series of circumstances that Eva's careful mind could have predicted, the same home. She reached the end of a chapter, set her pen down, rolled her shoulders, and looked across the table at him. "Come to bed," she said. He stood without hesitation and banked the fire and followed her down the hall, and the house went quiet around them, and the snow kept falling over Wyoming, and everything that had needed to be resolved had been resolved, and everything that had needed to be built had been built. And the life they had made from a wanted poster and a jail cell and a cedar box of letters and a restaurant table and a parlor floor and a church and 2 children asleep upstairs was whole and warm and completely, irreversibly and beautifully theirs.